Your lecturer is Professor Ann Curzan. Dr. Curzan is Arthur F. Thurnau Professor of English at the University of Michigan. She received her BA in Linguistics from Yale University and both her MA and PhD in English Language and Literature from the University of Michigan. Professor Curzan has published on a wide range of topics, including linguistics, pedagogy, and lexicography, and is a member of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language. She has received numerous teaching awards and shares her insights on language on Michigan Radio's weekly segment, That's What They Say.
One of the many wonderful things about studying English words is that we make up new ones all the time. For example, flexitarian. Do you happen to know any flexitarians? That's probably a hard question to answer if you're not sure what a flexitarian is. This is a relatively new word created in the last decade, and you may be able to guess at its parts. It is flexible plus vegetarian, defined as a vegetarian who occasionally eats meat, or as I like to put it, a vegetarian who eats meat when convenient. This word was voted the most useful word of the year in 2003 by the American Dialect Society. It captures a new dietary approach and a cultural shift in attitudes about food. Now, if you didn't know this word before, you may now be thinking, I know people like that. Or perhaps, I am a person like that. I just never had a word for it. So flexitarian is a playful new word, but one that serves a real purpose in the language. The Word of the Year vote is an actual vote. Every January, the American Dialect Society Conference meets, and we vote on the Word of the Year. And I'm one of the folks who votes. In fact, anyone who attends the conference is allowed to vote, as well as participate in the usually very lively debate about new words that we have. And I'll tell you a bit about that vote in a few minutes, but first, let me introduce myself. My name is Ann Curzan, and I have loved language since I was a kid. I think that my very peculiar talent at Boggle may have been my first sign that I would spend my life studying language. I started learning foreign languages in junior high school, and over the years I've acquired a range, from French and Latin to Russian and Chinese. And then in college, I discovered linguistics, and I completely fell in love. Here was a field, the systematic study of language, that allowed me to study the structure of language and the history of language. And it let me understand all those quirks that we see and hear in the language every day. At the University of Michigan, I study and teach the history of the English language, which means that I spend my days thinking about how the language works and how it changes over time. And as I move through the world, I notice all the changes in English that are happening all around me. For example, the creation of Google, first as a noun and then quickly becoming a verb, so we were Googling things. I hear height. I notice the recent use of troop to refer to a soldier. And I hear the confusion of lay and lie in the song lyric, I just want to lay in my bed. We'll talk about all these examples in the coming lectures as we explore where words come from and how they change over time. I like calling this kind of investigation exploring the secret lives of words, because what we're doing is digging below the surface of English words. We use words every day and we take them for granted. I mean, we have to, because if we're going to talk with each other, we can't think about every word we're saying and where it came from. But it's fascinating when we do pause and consider where these words came from and how they work. It tells us a lot about language and about ourselves as speakers. Now, some of you may have cringed when I said height, or I quoted the song lyric, I want to lay in my bed. These are examples of language change, exactly what we'll be talking about. And I'm struck every day by the vibrancy of our language and our creativity with it, as we exploit the riches of English vocabulary and create new words, or we change the meaning of words we already have, or sometimes we just abandon words, stop using them. Language is one of the things that makes us human. No other species, as far as we know, has this capacity for human language, for language that is infinitely creative. And it seems to be a human impulse to play with language, to use that creativity as we talk every day. There also seems to be a human impulse to worry about language and to lament the changes going on, to worry that young people are somehow ruining the language, and to think that there was some earlier moment when the language was in better shape than it's in today. In this course, we'll look at great detail at how words work and change in order to gain perspective on this concern about decay and insight into the many fascinating things happening in the language and in the human brain and in human culture. And we see all of this reflected in the history of words. There's much to celebrate and study in the unlimited human capacity to create new words and new utterances. And in fact, as I mentioned, one of the things that I do professionally is vote on the word of the year. So let me tell you a little bit about how this happens. The American Dialect Society has its annual meeting at the beginning of January, and we present a whole range of academic papers, but we also vote on the word of the year. We've been doing this for about 20 years. The organization itself has been studying American English since 1889. This is a gathering of linguists and lexicographers, the people who make dictionaries, whose job it is to track new words and meanings. This vote always happens on Friday afternoon, and perhaps I should note that it always happens right before happy hour. And what's been interesting is that this meeting has been getting more and more crowded. We now have over 200 people who come. There's an open floor for debate about the words. And as Alan Metcalf, who runs the vote, has been known to say, as he counts the votes by hand, we all just raise our hands, all vote counting is approximate but final. So this vote, which celebrates language change and lexical creativity, happens often just about a week after Lake Superior State has put out its list of banished words for the year. Words that they're tired of, often exactly because they've been so successful. So for 2012, the words that they banished were ginormous, blowback, man cave, and occupy, among others. So what did we do in January at the Word of the Year vote? Well, this year, we voted occupy as the word of the year. And this often happens, that what Lake Superior State has banished, we vote as the word of the year because it has been such a big part of the lexicon in that year. So 2012, the word of the year was occupy. The year before that, it was app. And the year before that, it was tweet. In the 90s, some of the words of the year were E, as in email, Y2K, Chad was the word of the year for 2000, and 9/11 was the word of the year for 2001. For 2003, the word of the year was metrosexual, which is a fashion-conscious heterosexual male, and it had been on the front page of the New York Times that year. Now, one of the things I love is that we don't just vote on the word of the year, but we have other categories. For example, most useful word of the year. In the 1990s, one of the most useful words of the year was dot, as in .com. And you'll notice that's not a new word, but it is a new use of a word. To Google, one most useful one year. Blog, one most useful. And a couple of years ago, fail, as a noun, one. And I remember when my students taught me the phrase, an epic fail, which is not just a fail, but it is a fail that involves some hubris in it. Another category, which I think is my favorite, is most creative word of the year. A few years ago, that was Google Ganger. And this is a word formed on Doppelganger. And a Google Ganger is when you Google yourself, it's the people who come up who are not you, but share your name. Those are your Google Gangers. Another most creative was Dracula sneeze. This was happening the year of H1N1, and this is when we were all told to sort of sneeze into our elbows. One of my favorites is recombobulation area. This is, or at least was, at the Milwaukee airport, and it was an area so that after you went through security and you had to, for example, put your belt back on and otherwise recombobulate, you could do so in the recombobulation area. And then my all-time favorite, most creative word is multislacking, which is the act of having multiple windows up on your screen so that it looks like you're working when you're actually surfing the web. This list captures some of the many things that we can learn from looking at words. We can learn about technological developments, for example, app, or tweet, or Google. We can see historical events captured in the language, Occupy, 9/11, bailout, Chad. We can see cultural changes, metrosexual, flexitarian. We get to witness our creativity and playfulness with new words, such as multislacking and Dracula sneeze. And we see the power of words. I have to say the word 9/11 still has a kind of visceral power for me. And I think for many people that is just a word that remains very evocative. Now these are all relatively new words, which can tell us about our cultural moment. We're also going to spend a lot of time in this course looking back in time, looking at where more established words come from, and learning from the stories that they have to tell. I would argue that there is no such thing as a boring word in the English language. Every word has a secret life from which we can learn. And let me start to make my case by telling you about the word of the millennium vote in the year 2000, which involved the words the and she. So in 2000, when we went to the Word of the Year vote, we were told that not only did we need to vote on the Word of the Year, but we also needed to vote on the Word of the Millennium. Now, if you had to look back at the past millennium and select the Word of the Millennium, how would you go about that? What criteria would you use? And at the meeting, there was a lot of debate about, are we talking about the word as a word, or are we talking about the word as a concept? And can you tell the difference between a word as a word and a word as a concept? So we then were talking about, should we look at more highfalutin borrowed terms from French or Latin or Greek? Or would it be better to go with a long-standing Germanic word that took on new meaning or prominence during the millennium? We had both kinds of words on the final ballot. So the final four were government, science, she, and the. And I have to say, I am the person who nominated she. Be upfront about that. Government and science, both borrowed from French, right around the time of Chaucer. She is a word you might never imagine has a good or slightly odd story to tell. The fact is, we're not sure where the word she comes from. It has fairly mysterious origins. First appears in a written document in 1154. It's not that Old English didn't have a word for she, it's just the word was heo, not she. The is a long-standing Germanic word, and you would think, well then how does it get to be up for the word of the millennium? It's because in Old English it functioned like a relative pronoun, the way we now use that and which. So its use as an article, as in the book, is new to this millennium. So here's how the vote went. We had those four, government, science, the, and she. First, government was eliminated. You can take that as you will. In the next round, the was eliminated. And I have to say, at that point, as a she supporter, I knew that we would win, because I knew that all the small word people would come over to our side. And sure enough, she was voted the word of the millennium. It's new to the millennium. It may reflect language contact with Old Norse in the Old English period. It's change at the very core of English. And many people argued it captures gains by women over the millennium. And one should embrace the chance to celebrate a pronoun. I'm excited to spend this course talking with you about words and about all that we can learn from them as we celebrate words and we study them seriously. In this course, as we explore the English vocabulary, we're going to keep returning to a few themes. And I want to go through those now, and I'm going to give you 4 themes that will be recurring throughout the course. The first theme is that English words are a mixed bag. They come from many languages, in addition to the native Germanic words. In other words, this is a rich, multi-layered vocabulary. I'm always struck whenever anyone refers to pure English because I'm not sure what that means. As long as there's been English, there have been borrowed words in English. And by looking at these words, we can learn about our encounters with speakers of other languages. English words, the English vocabulary, reflects a history of extensive language contact. The history of English is the history of language contact in Britain, in the Americas, and around the world through imperialism and colonization, and now through globalization and world Englishes. English stands out among languages in terms of just how many words the English language has borrowed. It also helps us see how different kinds of words cluster in different parts of the lexicon. So, for example, you'll see a lot of Greek and Latin in medicine, and it just so happens on the SAT. When you think about it, a word like impediment, which we borrowed from Latin, is a kind of bump that impedes you, but impediment is on the SAT, and bump is not. The second theme, and I've already mentioned this one, is that words are powerful. There's an expression like, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Well, this simply isn't true, and we all know it. We all know that words can be incredibly powerful, can be more hurtful than almost anything. And in fact, there are some words that are so powerful, we won't even say them. We also know the power in being able to manipulate words to express what we want to say and how we want to say it. We know the power of saying something like, I love you. We also know the power of using a statement like, mistakes were made, where we don't identify who made them. Language is a significant part of our identity. The words we choose tell people a lot about who we are and the communities that we identify with. So this is again, as I said, part of being human and part of our identity, every single one of us. And we also know that sometimes words fail us, that there can be an idea that just leaves us groping around for words, or we can be trying to do something like express sympathy after a death, and we can feel like words just aren't enough. So that's our second theme, is the power of words. The third theme is that words change all the time. English, as a living language, is ever changing. The human mind is a creative one, and with that creativity, we change the language. You just can't stop us from doing it. It's a natural part of language and not in any way a destructive force. Linguists just don't believe that there's erosion in languages or that there's some endpoint or destination and the language is getting better and better to get to that. I recognize the worry about change. And I'm not going to say that I don't have my pet peeves, because I do. And sometimes I hear things and I think, really? We're going to use interface for talk? But I recognize that this is just my personal reaction. This is my personal pet peeve. And I know that, for example, at the end of the 19th century, Dean Alford really didn't like the word reliable. And we now look at that and think that's so quaint that he thought there was something wrong with reliable, and someone will think that about me and the word interface. Looking at change in the past, we can learn a lot about our history. And we need to realize or be comfortable with the idea that the changes around us are also much more interesting than worrisome. It may seem like common sense to think about language change as language error. But I'll be framing change much more often as creativity and not as error. This is how linguists think about change, compared with, for example, writers of usage guides. And so we will not be using much of the language of error and much more the language of change and creativity. And this relates to the fourth theme of the course, which is that studying English words is going to ask you to rethink some very common notions about language. As speakers of English, we all bring a lot of knowledge to the table. And along with that can come some pretty strong belief systems about how language works, many of which have been learned or reinforced in school, as well as in popular usage guides, perhaps in conversations within your home. We have strong ideas about what's correct and what's incorrect. But I want to raise some questions about that in this course. I mean, who gets to say if a word is a real word? If you and I both know what the word ain't means, why do so many language authorities say that there's something wrong with it? These are important and challenging questions about our everyday experience with words and about the resources we rely on to tell us about words. So as I said, I will be moving away from words like right and wrong to think in more nuanced ways about the competing forces of language change and the benefits of having a standard variety, and the ways that we all negotiate every day choosing different words in different contexts. For example, right now, I sound more like an English professor than I sound when I'm not doing this kind of lecture. Along the way, you're going to learn many wonderful linguistic facts. I often describe myself as a fount of random linguistic information, and I tell my students that every day they will get at least one party trick, one random fact about words that they can use to start conversation. And I remember the time that I had a student sitting in the first row, and I said that on the first day of class, and he raised his hand and he said, "What kind of parties do you go to?" But then by the third or fourth class, he was back saying, "My roommates want to know what we're going to learn today." So we're going to talk about some of these quirky things, like why is the word kernel spelled the way it is? Why does dive have two past tenses, dived and dove? What do we learn from patterns like governor and governess, where governor has stayed a positive term, governess has lowered in status? Why is there a bias in the English language against left-handed people? We would say something like 2 left feet versus someone's right-hand man. We'll talk about all of these in the lectures to come. For the remainder of this first lecture, I want to talk about the scope of the phrase English words, as it's foundational to what we'll be doing in the course. How big is the English vocabulary? What is encompassed under English words? What counts as a word? And how many are there? Now, I have to be upfront and say there isn't actually a good answer to the question of exactly how big the English vocabulary is. It depends on who you ask. In Webster's Third New International Dictionary, which is the most recent unabridged, there are 450,000 words. They omitted all the words that were obsolete by 1755, except those found in well-known works. Most college dictionaries have somewhere between 50,000 and 180,000 words. But a recent study using Google Books estimated that the English lexicon in the year 2000 was just over 1 million words, compared with just over 500,000 in 1900. So that's pretty explosive growth. Alan Walker Reed, a wonderful linguist, has put the number at 4 million words. And he did his calculation by saying 700,000 in the Merriam-Webster files, 1 million scientific terms, and then you have regional expressions, foreign borrowings, trade names, new slang words we haven't recorded yet. Okay, so that's a lot of words, which raises another important question. How many words does the average speaker know? Well, we can start with this fact. It is many less than any dictionary. Most estimates say that a college-educated speaker's receptive vocabulary is somewhere between 20 and 50,000 words. Okay, so you're going to see that's a much smaller number than sort of the average dictionary, which means that you can do something like open up a dictionary and see how many words you don't know. And I did exactly that using a Merriam-Webster's, and I found a lot I didn't know. I ended up, as I opened randomly, to the M page, and I discovered these words: muscarine, a toxic ammonium base; muon, an unstable lepton that is common in the cosmic radiation near the Earth's surface; muntjac, any of a genus of small deer in southeastern Asia; and muntin, a strip separating panes of glass in a sash. And I have to say, I didn't know any of those words. And then there was another word, murmurous, which is characterized by murmurs, which I recognized, but I'm not sure that I've ever used. So there you see, and this is something that you can try yourself, that you open up a dictionary and see what words you don't know. And you'll notice, I think, one of the things that's useful to differentiate is the difference between your active vocabulary and your passive vocabulary. That your active vocabulary is the words you actually use on a regular basis or at all, and your passive or receptive vocabulary these are the words that you recognize. So something like murmurous for me is probably more in my passive vocabulary, certainly a word that I can read and know, but not a word that I use every day. So that starts to address the question of how big the lexicon is. Now let's talk about what counts as English. I mentioned the issue of scientific vocabulary, which is arguably the most rapidly growing part of the lexicon. Some people say that there are at least 200,000 medical terms. And then, for example, there are all the names we have for chemical compounds. So if you put all those in the English lexicon, the lexicon gets big really fast. But many of us don't control that vocabulary. Dictionaries, in fact, are filled with highly specialized items, some of them borrowed, some of them not. And a useful distinction there may be between the core of the vocabulary and then the periphery. And the periphery are these highly specialized terms that if you're in a particular field, you may know those terms. But even in the core, it is remarkable how much borrowing there is. And it reflects the history of the language. That some people say that if you take the most common 1,000 words in English, over 80% of them are native Germanic words. Okay? But if you go to the next most common 1,000 words, over 60% of those are borrowed. Over 60%. That is really an incredible number for how many words English has taken in from other languages. You may also be thinking, well, then when does a borrowed word become English? We could take an example like sushi. I think we'd all agree that that feels pretty English now. What would you say about the word hamachi for yellowtail? Does that feel English to you? It's in the OED. They've decided to put it in. You could question or support that decision. It's also important to realize that as English spreads around the world, it's developing new varieties, many of which have words specific to that region. So, for example, in Singaporean English, you have the Malay word makan, which means to eat. And you see this happening all around the world, the same way that American English, when it was developing, was borrowing words from the Native American languages that it encountered, such as moose and squash. In this course, we'll focus mostly on the long established varieties of English, obviously particularly British English, American English, Canadian and Australian English. But we're also going to spend time talking about the many varieties of English that together make up what we would call the English language. And it's important to remember that this includes standard varieties and non-standard varieties. That it's not that standard English is English. Standard English is one part of English. As linguist John McWhorter has said, what a language is really a bundle of dialects, and so what fits under English is all the many varieties of English, both standard and non-standard. So in thinking about the lives of words and how they work and where they came from, we'll be thinking about the past, the present, and the future of English and of its speakers. Through words, we'll have a chance to talk about history and culture, about the systematicity of language and the irregularity of language, and the wonders of the creative human brain. In this lecture, I've introduced several key themes that we'll be returning to, including the mixed or borrowed bag of English words, the fundamental power of words, the ever-changing nature of language and the words in it, and the way that studying words can challenge some fundamental assumptions about how language works. In the next lecture, we're going to be turning to this question of what a word is. After all, if we're going to talk about questions such as how big the English vocabulary is, we should come to some kind of agreement about what counts as a word. You may have been thinking when I said that the prefix E was voted as Word of the Year, is that a word? So we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the lifespan of a word. So let me leave you with two questions to think about for the next lecture. 1, when is a word born? And 2, when does it die?